Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Kendall College of Art and Design. If you're not one of our local students here, my name is Robert Shirdy. I teach art history here. I'm also a former student of Dr. Mitchell. And it is my pleasant duty to introduce him. W.J.T. Mitchell is a Gaylord Donnelly Distinguished Service Professor of English and Art History at the University of Chicago. Having received his BA from Michigan State University, he went on to complete both his MA and his PhD at the Johns Hopkins University. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Academy for the Humanities, and the American Philosophical Society, among others. He has written over 80 articles, as far as I could count, appearing in numerous journals such as Art in America, October, Art Bulletin, Art Forum, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, among others. And he is the author of at least 11 books and is currently working on 3 new titles. His book, Picture Theory, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1994, has had a profound influence on the way artists and art historians look at and interpret art. In 1996, Picture Theory was awarded the College Art Association's Charles Rufus Murray Award for Distinguished Scholarship in the area of art history. Further, Professor Mitchell has been the editor of the journal Critical Inquiry since 1978. During his tenure, Critical Inquiry has been recognized for its scholarly excellence on 3 different occasions in 1981, 1988, and 1998. Dr. Mitchell has lectured at universities and art museums throughout the United States, in Europe, and in the Far East. Recent special teaching assignments include the Mellon Faculty Seminar at Tulane University, a seminar on Romanticism at Beijing Foreign Studies University in China, and a post as Canterbury Visiting Fellow at Canterbury University in New Zealand, among others. In the spring of 2002, he was awarded the Berlin Prize Fellowship to the American Academy in Berlin. On a personal note, Dr. Mitchell was a professor of mine at the University of Chicago some years ago, not that long ago. The class on Turner and Ruskin is one of the more memorable of my experiences, and I still use ideas gleaned from that course in my classes today. In short, Professor Mitchell is one of those people whose influence changed the course of my life as an art historian and as a teacher. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you this evening W.J.T. Mitchell, who will address us on the topic of cloning terror, the War of Images, 9/11 to Abu Ghraib. Professor Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Bobby. And can you all hear me okay? Is this all right? Let's hope this works. Yes. This is not I'm not going to read a paper to you. I'm going to talk through some slides, so you'll have to excuse the pauses, the ums and ahs, and the moments when I lose my place and then find it somewhere else. But what I want to talk about is something we've all lived through in recent history and are, in fact, still in the midst of. This is one reason why I'm writing a book by that title, Cloning Terror, but it's not finished, and it's very difficult to finish a book about a historical moment which has not yet achieved closure. That's why I start with showing you this image, which is an artistic appropriation of a very familiar cultural icon, what's sometimes called the Abu Ghraib man, or the man on the box, and he has many other names which we will see as we go along. this was put up over a Los Angeles freeway in the summer of 2004, shortly after the Abu Ghraib images came to light. And it signaled at the time, I think, the demise of the final alibi for the war in Iraq. By this point, everyone knew there were no weapons of mass destruction. Everyone knew there was no connection between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. And the only alibi left for the war in Iraq was the moral claim that somehow we were liberating the Iraqis, we were bringing them freedom, we were bringing them a new regime of democracy and equality. This set of images, of course, completely undercut that the moral claim that this was a war for a good cause. Not that it wasn't true that Saddam Hussein was a terrible person, but the notion that we were bringing goodness and light was severely damaged by this image. In fact, I spoke at a teach-in shortly after these images appeared, and the head of Naval ROTC at Northwestern University, who was also there, said, that image that you're showing is more dangerous to the U.S. mission in Iraq than any weapons of mass destruction. Because if you do lose the claim to a just war, you've really lost the war. It appears now, a couple of years later, that slowly, ever so slowly, it's becoming clear that the war in Iraq is lost. The British, just yesterday, announced that they are going to begin withdrawal. It appears that George W. Bush is going to be the last person on earth, except perhaps for Laura, who thinks that this war can still be won in any kind of meaningful sense. The American people have spoken in the most recent election that this war is over, or should be over, or it better be over pretty soon. But I think the war in Iraq is actually, even if it does end successfully, there is a bigger question, a much bigger war that needs also to be over, and that is the so-called war on terror. You may have noticed that both parties agree that the war on terror is an absolute imperative. We've got to fight that, even if the war in Iraq is lost. The whole argument of my book, of this talk tonight, is that the really dangerous war, the war that we are definitely losing, that we could never win in a million years, and that could go on indefinitely, certainly through my lifetime and through yours, is the so-called war on terror. And that one refuses to end. And why is that? Well, I think partly because if you simply analyze the phrase war on terror, you realize it is a war of images. It's a war it's a metaphorical war. You cannot make a war on terror. You can make a war on typhus, a war on poverty, and the reason those phrases work is because they are understood to be metaphorical. That is, we understand that when we talk about the war on poverty, we're not sending in the army to do that. We're not bombing anybody's cities in order to destroy the poverty there. Terrorism doesn't work that way. Terrorism is, well, a tactic, a political and military tactic, and terror itself is the name of an emotion. You cannot make war on an emotion. You cannot make war on a tactic. This has been recognized by many commentators, but it is a firm article of belief among the inner circle of Bush advisors that the war on terror is no metaphor. Dick Cheney himself said this several years ago when somebody pointed out, this is really, you can't literally mean you want to make a war on terror. He said, oh no, it's not a metaphor. We are literally going to do it. So this is the strange, uncanny logic of our time. A metaphor has been literalized. That is, it's been made real, concrete, to the cost of 3,000 American GIs and perhaps 100, 200,000 uncounted Iraqis. And this is part of a war of images, a war that is a metaphor which has tragically been made literal. I just want to quote to you a small passage from the Wall Street Journal, based on an interview by the reporter Ron Suskind. This was in October 2004, when he questioned an unnamed senior official in the Bush administration about the kind of utopian imaginary, the idea that you could actually send an army out and defeat terror or defeat extremism, these vague abstractions which have been given a life of their own. This is the response that Ron Suskind reports. The aide said that guys like me were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. I nodded and murmured something about Enlightenment principles and empiricism. He cut me off. That's not the way the world really works anymore. He continued, we're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can then study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. I've never heard such a candid declaration about this process of turning a metaphor into a reality, of taking an illusion, an extremely dangerous illusion, and then realizing it with bombs and military hardware to the expense of lots of human bodies. But that's what we're caught in the midst of. And until that metaphor is smashed, until we understand that you cannot make a war on terror, it will go on. And it'll continue to grip the imagination of this country like a kind of psychosis. So what I'm going to do is take you through a set of theses about war and images first. And let's face it, war has always been as much about imagination as it has been about bombs and bullets and spears and swords. It's always about destroying the morale of the enemy, attacking psychologically, making the enemy feel humiliated, defeated, destroying their morale by an attack on the imagination. But terrorism, above all, is an attack on the imaginary. Terrorists never conquer nations. They don't do it, not by military conquest. What they do is to set in motion a psychological process which turns a national imaginary against itself, producing a self-destructive cycle. What Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden managed to launch on September 11th was a self-destructive process, namely a war on terror. They lured us into it, and I'll talk later about how explicit they were. I mean, it wasn't like this was a secret strategy. This was the declared strategy which we walked into. So I'm going to take you through a few examples of the way a war, and a war on terror specifically, exploits images or is built on images and fantasies that accelerate this process of self-destruction. This is the only weapons of mass destruction that were found in Iraq. Whoops, why is it bouncing back? Stay there. This is a mural over a highway leading to Baghdad, and it shows it's a painting of the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein imagined he had, or wanted the world to believe that he had, and which, of course, with our so-called intelligence services, we bought hook, line, and sinker and decided, well, they must have them. The only weapons, you notice that the sky is filled with missiles and jet planes coming out of the mosque. The only real weapons that turned up are the front two rows of soldiers wearing hoods. Those are the suicide bombers with the explosives strapped around them. Those were the only real weapons that we had to worry about. But in order to, out of the fantasy that we were facing all of the other things that are in that picture, a fantasy which could have easily been dispelled and surely was dispelled within a few months of the invasion of Iraq. That's what lured us into this war in the first place. And it was a fantasy that was adopted and exploited by the Bush administration. But it only existed, you might say, as a work of art. Maybe not a very good work of art, but certainly an extremely powerful and effective one. It exemplifies exactly the fantasy that lured us into the war in Iraq. Then the war itself was conducted largely by symbolic gestures of destruction. Most conspicuous, the famous photo op of the pulling down of Saddam Hussein's statue, a photo op which was preceded by this photo op, which you may recall, which turned out to be rather incautious and ill-advised. It was a photo op which immediately the colonel in command of this detachment realized that this was not going to look like an image of liberation to the Iraqis. It was going to look like an image of occupation, of conquest, of humiliation of the head of state and the replacement of his face with the national logo of the conquering army. But something has happened to images in our time. Once you put them out in the world, it can be very difficult to withdraw them. So this image was made as a kind of weapon of conquest, but immediately the weapon, it was felt this is a weapon that can be turned against the United States, and of course it was. A lot of this war has been fought in terms of photo ops of this sort. Here's another one. You all recognize this. It was a videotape loop that ran over and over again in December of 2004. And again, it's about a kind of direct assault on the head of state, the humiliation of that head, the attempt to penetrate inside of it. And of course, immediately reappropriated, relocated on the T-shirt of a protester who sees it as searching for the weapons of mass destruction. We'll come back to this image in a few minutes in another light. Before the war in Iraq, there was already a war of images loosed by the Taliban in Afghanistan when they decided to destroy the Buddhist idols. What they called idols, statues of the Buddha. And this is another aspect of the war of images I'd like to underline as a kind of preliminary. That is that when wars are fought for images or by means of images, one of the most important kinds of tactics is the destruction of an image, whether it's the pulling down of Saddam Hussein, the disgracing of him by photographing a dental examination, or the photographing and televising of the destruction of an image. The destruction of the World Trade Towers themselves, which came not so long after the destruction of the Buddhist idols, was a similar act of iconoclasm. So when you make a war of images, one of the things you must do is destroy certain images, images which you understand to be valuable to, sacred to those who you oppose. And it's important that not just the destruction take place, but that an image of the destruction, a secondary image, be put in circulation. So this is a kind of a Taliban calendar which records the destruction of the Buddhist statues and memorializes that destruction as a holy act. So I hope you see that it's not just about using images as weapons, but also the way an image as a weapon can suddenly turn against the user. And it's not just about the destruction of images, but also about the way that destruction turns into a secondary image, an image of iconoclasm, a kind of paradoxical concept. The World Trade Towers, of course, being the launching act of iconoclasm, the destruction of the icon of world trade, of U.S. hegemony and capitalist domination. This, and of course, one of the great problems with the destruction of this image is the seeming inability to reconstruct it, to find a way of rebuilding it. This is an imagined rebuilding by a pastor, Tony Mavrakos, who urges that we erect an imaginary replica of the Twin Towers in the form of the twin tablets of the Ten Commandments. And here is Tony Mavrakos' commentary on this image. We're providing this picture free so you can get it into people's hands, homes, and hearts. This is the actual skyline of New York City where the Twin Towers once stood. They're gone, but standing where they once stood are two other Twin Towers that no one can take down, including terrorists, the American judicial system, the ACLU, or the American atheists, the Ten Commandments, your brother in Christ. This is also, I think, an important aspect of a war of images. Wars of images always have a tendency to become holy wars. From the destruction of the Buddhist statues to the destruction of the World Trade Center to this attempt at rebuilding them in the imaginary as the tablets of the law. Tony Mavrakos might be surprised to learn two things. One is that those tablets of the law were also regarded as sacred by Islam. They have the same Ten Commandments, and that the second commandment is a commandment against graven images. And some people take it also as a commandment to engage in acts of iconoclasm, to destroy the images of the enemy, to engage in image jihad, as it were. So where is Pastor Mavrakos in this logic? Is he building a new idol? I'm not sure, but he's doing something extremely strange. And then there's the moment when the image is not any longer just a picture, a statue, or even a building, but the actual bodies. In the case of the Twin Towers, they were filled with bodies. In this case, these are the contractors at Fallujah, the terrible atrocity, being dragged from their cars, burned, and then strung up over the Euphrates. And I think it's important to note again, first, that this is an act of iconoclasm, that is, destroying the image of the human body, in this case, an actual human body, and then staging it as an image of the mutilated, destroyed body. This is clearly a photo op. You can see that the crowd is addressing itself to the camera, and the cameraman has followed along. It was meant to be seen, and this image was meant to be circulated worldwide. Immediately after, the mullahs of Fallujah condemned this, said, very bad, this means that Fallujah will pay for this, which it certainly did. I mean, Fallujah, a city of 300,000 people, scarcely exists today. It was liberated from its life, and many, many more bodies were burned to revenge this act of corporeal iconoclasm. And then there's the forbidden images. Part of the war of images is trying to control their circulation, to keep some of them out of the public view. The Abu Ghraib photographs, within a few days of the revelation that they existed, the Pentagon sent orders that all the soldiers would receive amnesty if they just turned in their photographs. It was recognized immediately these photos would be highly destructive of the war effort. Similarly, as you know, since the first Gulf War, the procession of flag-draped caskets of U.S. soldiers returning home has been banned from public view. It is now a criminal act to photograph these caskets. In the Vietnam War, of course, the procession of flag-draped caskets was one of the images that signaled the end of that war. The procession of caskets became so great that it was impossible to contain this melancholy image of the futility of our war. But now Congress actually, in the summer of 2004, passed legislation banning the circulation of these images, which of course had the effect of producing a kind of hyper-circulation of them. The banning of the image makes the image, often makes the image more powerful. It may, under some circumstances, be possible to erase an image from the world, but it's one of the most difficult things to do, and especially in the age we live in, the age of digital imaging, which I want to come to next. Here's another incautious photo opportunity, which was taken as an icon of triumph and victory, remember? Mission accomplished. Followed almost immediately by its reduction to an object of ridicule. And immediately this photo op was disavowed by the White House. And the Mission Accomplished banner, they went through acrobatic hoops to try to deny they had anything to do with that photo op. But sometimes you create an image and you think it's to your advantage, turns out to be just the opposite. And that was certainly the case here. Now, digital imaging, I think, has changed the whole character of both images themselves and of terrorism, especially if we think about terrorism as a war conducted by things like photo ops, iconoclasm, the circulation of triumphal images, and the destruction of images. What does digital imaging do? Well, one thing is it makes the image circulate much more rapidly than it ever has before. Digital images, photographs were already difficult to contain. As Walter Benjamin pointed out, they could be indefinitely multiplied, but digital images accelerate that multiplication. There's a kind of new life to the image in the digital regime that makes it possible to copy them more rapidly and to make them circulate globally much more rapidly. So this image, which has now become the central icon of the war in Iraq, and 100 years from now, I suspect this is the image that will be remembered as the icon of this moment and of this war, it begins to clone itself. This is a still image from an online work by the same group that put it up on the LA freeway. It's a group called freewayblogger.com. And if you look up Freeway Blogger and come to this, you will find a Beach Boys song about going to spend your summer vacation on the sands of Iraq, accompanied to a chorus line of the Abu Ghraib man. It's as if they're illustrating the very life of the digital image, the way it clones itself over and over again. This is the original. A photo which, when it was taken simultaneously by two different photographers, I'm sure they had no inkling of what it was they were loosing on the world. But this is the image that brought the moral war to an end and signaled to the world an acceleration of the energies of jihad worldwide, because this became immediately circulated on television throughout the Arab world, on protest posters in every capital. A subject of imitation, artistic adaptation, as in this mural in Baghdad, which turned the man on the box, the Abu Ghraib man, into a kind of twin figure with the Statue of Liberty. But a Statue of Liberty portrayed not as the liberator, but as a Ku Klux Klan figure, also wearing a hood, but in this case the torturer's hood, which pairs up with the hood of the torture victim. The only difference being, are there eye holes or not? In one case, enforcing the anonymity of the torturer, in the other, the anonymity of the victim. And this Statue of Liberty reaching up not to the torch of liberty, but to the electrical switch. So after this image appeared, this metaphor began to assert itself as a vernacular phrase throughout Iraq. And they refer now to the man on the box, or the Abu Ghraib man, as the Statue of Liberty. This piece by Guy Caldwell in Berkeley was the cause of a riot in the summer of 2004. What Caldwell did was to take the pornographic images that came out of Abu Ghraib, the stripping of prisoners naked, leaving them to sleep on concrete floors for days and days, giving them cold showers and leaving them to shiver all night in freezing conditions. Caldwell combined that with the figure of the man on the box, and then he tripled it, made it into as if you could clone this figure. And then I think one of the most interesting, a silk screen by a group called Forkscrew Graphics in Boston, which was produced as a kind of, by this point, an abstracted image of the original icon. No longer any need to add the details of texture of the blanket or the C-ration box that the original shows you. Now he becomes a pure silhouette, a schematism, as if it could be abstracted like a corporate logo. And, in fact, inserted with a parallel corporate logo, the iPod and the Iraq man joined together in a kind of culture jamming display. This from the Bleecker Street station in New York City. I also think this image, it's a kind of, the image moves in two directions. One in the direction of suggesting something about the way these images got absorbed so quickly into global image culture, thereby to some extent neutralizing them. It's as if the image sort of disappears and then reappears. It also, I think, is a very kind of insidious reflection on the relation between the whole iPod concept and the torture concept. It's as if torture and self-pleasuring are made in parallel here, because, of course, in the iPod, you are wrapped up in yourself as well. In one case, wrapped up in your own pain, in the other, absorbed in your own pleasure. And both products of American technology, you might say. So that's what I think the digital image does. It makes for this proliferation and rapid transformation, mutation of an image, and prevents it from being contained or remaining just as one thing. Now, I want to suggest that every image regime has a kind of master image that lies behind it. Michel Foucault talks about the classical representation in Velázquez's painting Las Meninas, which shows the new mode of painting, easel painting, as the master image of the Renaissance. So what's the master image in our time? I want to suggest that it is cloning. Cloning as a kind of digital imaging of organisms themselves. That is a way of duplicating an actual life form. And this is what I offer as a meta picture of the clone in our time. This is a still image from Jurassic Park, 1994, a moment when the cloned velociraptor has been caught in the headlights of the camps of Jurassic Park's orientation film. And the DNA code which made it possible to clone this monster is being projected on his skin. So you see the letters, the 4 letters of the DNA code projected there. So this is an image of a new kind of image making. And it's a double newness. On the one hand, it signifies, of course, digital imaging and especially digital animation itself. The notion that now, in the new era of digital animation, we no longer move puppets, we no longer move handmade drawings, we work at a computer to make images move. And so beneath every image is a script, a code, a language. And in this case, the language has been put on the outside. But that's exactly analogous to the process, which is the premise of the film itself, of cloning extinct animals, bringing them back to life by mastering the DNA code that gave them life in the first place. So both digital animation and cloning fuse together in this extraordinary image. So the fourth thesis I want to explore, the clone. What is it? I suggest it's a deep copy of a life form that is a likeness of both the analog surface and the underlying digital code. The concept of the digital image, then, is a kind of oxymoron that expresses this double similitude. That is, usually we keep language and images separate. Word and image are of different orders. But with the digital revolution, we've produced new kinds of images. We call them digital images, and ordinarily we don't see the digits. In fact, that's exactly what we don't want to see. The digital image should look just like the analog image. It should perfectly personify the analog. But in the case of the digital raptor, we see the underlying code. It's laminated on the skin. Or in this other rather famous still image from The Matrix, this is the moment, remember, when Neo is supposed to see through the analog eyewash, the analog surface of reality that is a mere illusion, and sees the code itself. Just as Cypher, another character in the film, is always capable of looking at the code and then imagining the analog image that is behind that or is being transmitted by it. But here we see, this is really the digital image par excellence. The moment when we see both the digits and the analog simultaneously. Because even in the stream of alphanumeric ciphers, the ghosts of the three agents coming after Neo are there to be seen. When he sees them this way, though, it's as if he is master of the game because he understands the code and can control it. So this is, I want to suggest, the great double technical revolution of our time. Walter Benjamin suggested we lived in an age of mechanical reproduction, exemplified by the assembly line, the industrial assembly line, by machine tools and the production of machines, and by photography and cinema as the master image technologies. Now we live in a time when two new technical inventions, the computer, signified by the Turing machine on the right, and the double helix, the DNA code on the left, constitute something I want to call biocybernetics. That is a double technical revolution at the level of life forms and at the level of image making and the coding of information. These two things together produce, among other things, the figure of the clone and the digital image. Which brings us back to the motivation for this photo op, which I mentioned before was about humiliation of the head of state, a kind of literalizing of the use of a photo op. But what else are they doing here? It finally occurred to me one day, they're taking a DNA sample. And why are they doing that? Well, Saddam Hussein was famous for having lots of doubles out there. Cloning and doubling, of course, are one of the reasons that clones are such disturbing creatures is because they are twins. They are doubles of an organism, or triplets or quadruplets. Saddam was known to have about 4 or 5 doubles out there. So they took a DNA sample to be sure it was him. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, if this had been a clone of Saddam, the sample would have come up just fine. Could have been, it could be we only hanged his clone a few weeks ago and the real Saddam is still on the loose. So what's the issue with cloning? Well, I want to suggest that it is a fulfillment of the ancient dream of and the taboo against creating a living image. A taboo which harkens back to some of these religious issues around icons and images. This cartoon from the Chicago Tribune illustrates the religious point quite directly. God getting ready to reach out with a touch of life, and the laboratory scientist saying, thanks, but we've got that covered. So what's happened in our time with the invention of cloning is the realization of an ancient fear and an ancient hope. I mean, artists have always wanted to produce images that have a life, that are vital, whether it means exciting or whether they are lifelike or they simulate life, or they have some kind of animation to them. It's a very ancient dream, so ancient that it shows up in the Bible in Exodus 32, when the Israelites ask Aaron to make an idol for them because Moses has gone away. Moses is up on the mountain getting those 10 commandments, which contain that second commandment, forbidding this kind of thing. So the Israelites are celebrating the creation of the new living image. And of course, Moses is saying, well, yes, they actually are written in stone. And as you know, he proceeds to massacre 3,000 people and grinds down the calf into molten gold and forces them to drink it. So cloning, one of the religious taboos that is associated with cloning is exactly this ancient fear that if you make images, they will come alive, that they will take on a life of their own and ultimately become idols, which means images that people will sacrifice human life to. What do clones and terrorists have to do with each other? Well, I want to suggest that they are the twin icons of our time. That is, on the one hand, the terrorist in our time is the symbol of the latest development of the arts of death and destruction, whereas the clone is the symbol of the newest sciences of life, the great revolution in biotechnology that's been part of the culture we've lived through. These two images, then, I want to suggest resonate together as something like the twin icons of our time, Dolly the sheep and the destruction of the Twin Towers. Twin Towers, by the way, which were described long before their destruction by Jean Baudrillard as architectural clones. One of the reasons the towers were so unpopular was their faceless, anonymous, headless appearance and their kind of staggering architectural dominance over lower Manhattan. 20 years before their destruction, images of their destruction were already common, and you may remember the 1990s were filled with disaster films in which the towers are seen collapsing or being flooded or in one way or another. So this is one reason why when everybody saw this happen, they felt like it had already been staged or rehearsed hundreds of times in disaster films. Well, this is a big, long thesis. I'll read it to you. Cloning and terrorism are interwoven at a number of levels. Historical adjacency, political and theological or ideological synergy, and iconographic resemblance. In American political culture, terror is the iconic issue in a faith-based foreign policy. The war on terror, the holy war of good against evil, while cloning is the iconic issue in a faith-based domestic policy, the holy war on abortion, on women's reproductive rights, and homosexuality. I want to just run through illustrative images of each of these points. First, historical adjacency. It is just a fact that the war on terror and the emergence of the cloning issue as respectively the foreign policy and domestic policy things, that they are historically adjacent. In fact, on September 11th itself, if you had read the New York Times that day, of course the story would not have been September 11th. The story was cloning and the National Academy of Sciences urging a bigger supply of stem cells. Why? because in the months preceding this, the main issue on the neoconservative agenda was cloning and the imposing of restrictions on stem cell research. America's scientists were trying to resist, but at this point, Bush had already passed legislation, August 9th of 2001. So this headline on September 11th, merely a coincidence, but an overdetermined coincidence, because if you had looked at September 10th, at September 6th, in fact, at the previous 60 days, about two-thirds of the front page newspapers in America were about the cloning issue. That was what was front burner. Needless to say, after September 11th, that goes to the inner pages and terrorism is on the front. So I think it's important to realize that these two issues were salient political causes, and on September 11th they merged. They really became connected quite deeply. The second thing I want to suggest is the iconographic resemblance between the clone and the terrorist. If you go into Google image search and enter terrorists, you will come up with figures like this. These are hooded Palestinian fighters in the streets of Ramallah. If you enter clones, you will come up with figures like this, and like this, and like this. Anonymous warriors ready to sacrifice their lives, faceless, hooded, what Jean Baudrillard has called the acephalic figure, that is the headless, or at least the faceless. So one of the features of this convergence of the clone and the terrorist as icons has been exactly this, the image of anonymity. That is, they are all alike, and they have no distinguishing features. They duplicate themselves, and they're ready to donate their bodies. Many of the narratives about cloning are about the issue of organ donation, that clones potentially could be used. You could have your clone in cold storage, and then when you need a new lung, a new heart, a new liver, you will have one that's DNA ready to put into your body. One of the great phobias, and if you've seen the movie Island recently, you know this is the plot of this story, that the clones are there to sacrifice their lives. But of course, that's true of these clone stormtroopers too, which are all cloned from one individual in this case, and genetically engineered to reduce their initiative so that they will follow orders very carefully. So the figure of the suicide bomber, the figure of the sacrificial victim, but above all, the figure of the faceless, anonymous, kind of reduced human organism, what Giorgio Agamben calls bare life. That's the figure of the clone and the figure of the terrorist that converge as icons in our time. And then there's a convergence at the level of policy. And I'm thinking quite directly of government policy regarding cloning, especially under the Bush administration. The person who pretty much controls the national policy on cloning is a philosopher from the University of Chicago, one of my colleagues. His name is Leon Kass. And back in the 90s, when Clinton was still in office, he testified about his views on cloning, about the bioethics of cloning. And here's the Kass's statement. He says, "Repugnance is often the emotional bearer of deep wisdom, beyond reason's power fully to articulate it. Can anyone really give an argument fully adequate to the horror of father-daughter incest, or having sex with animals, or eating human flesh, or raping and murdering another human being? Would anyone's failure to give full rational justification for his revulsion at these practices make that revulsion ethically suspect? Not at all. In my view, our repugnance at human cloning belongs in this category." This was his testimony to the Bioethics Advisory Commission in 1997. So for Kass, cloning from a bioethical standpoint, it doesn't even need rational reflection. We don't need to talk about it because our revulsion at it is as instinctive as cannibalism, rape, incest, murder, or bestiality. All the most unspeakable perversions immediately equated with cloning. So naturally, when Bush was elected and he looked for somebody to be the head of his bioethics commission, Leon Cass took that position and immediately attached it to September 11th. Since September 11th, says Cass, one feels a palpable increase in America's moral seriousness. We see evil for what it is. We understand the need for a prudent middle course between the inhuman Osama bin Ladens on the one side and the post-human Brave New Worlders on the other. In other words, the terrorists and the cloners. So at the level of national policy, of course, the Bush administration, whenever it's been in trouble, has invoked terrorism. And cloning is a much more divisive issue. There are actually some things to be said for certain kinds of cloning. Therapeutic cloning, as opposed to reproductive, for instance, seems to be a very promising line of research. I'm personally totally against reproductive cloning, but therapeutic cloning of tissues seems like a really good idea. But the Cass position, the Bush position, is to deliberately confuse those two things, to equate cloning with terrorism, to equate cloning with rape, incest, bestiality, and so forth. One cartoonist actually glimpsed this logic quite directly. Aaron Magruder, a Chicago African-American cartoonist, in the run-up to the election, he must have been reading Karl Rove's mind, because he glimpsed what the hidden logic was. This is, remember, there was going to be an October surprise in which Osama bin Laden made a surprise appearance on television. Well, Magruder built on that and says, what will bin Laden say when he comes on television? So here's the answer. We call on all Muslims with knowledge of science and genetics to attack America, develop baby-killing stem cell research that will destroy their evil society. So Osama bin Laden comes on calling for jihadists to introduce cloning stem cell research. This series continued for about a week and a half. And here they have the television debate between the left and the right. This must have been, he was thinking of Fox News, I believe, when he did this. Today we're debating the new connection between stem cell research and Al-Qaeda. On the right, scientists caught doing stem cell research should be considered enemy combatants in the war on terrorism. And on the left, the usual reply, I agree. And then the premise that Magruder is building on here is that when you clone adult animals, they will have a shorter lifespan. There's a kind of clock in the DNA which has a limited lifespan, so clones age faster. So the attack ads, with the link between Al-Qaeda and stem cell research established, the attack ads begin. Welcome to John Kerry's vision of America's future. And you can see, I hope you can read that for yourself. I'm not going to read it for you. But it shows aging senior citizens going off to fight the war on terror, no doubt unsuccessfully. So what Magruder, with that kind of uncanny perception that cartoonists often grasp when they see that images are being mobilized for political purposes, he glimpsed what the two images were. They were cloning and terrorism being brought together. And if you think about the campaign of 2004, it was as if Karl Rove said, let's have a debate on evolution. We know we will win that. Let's have a debate on abortion, on reproductive rights, and on gay marriage. Sometime in the 1980s, the word clone got attached to male homosexuals. Why? Partly because they were seen as duplicates, but perverse duplicates of highly masculine men. Al Parker, gay superstar, is written up, his life is written up in this book, called clone. He was the original clone. And the idea that Al Parker, or the image that Al Parker introduced to the world, was the notion of the gay man as not a sissy, not a dandy, no pinky in the air, but a macho guy, a truck driver, a cowboy, a weightlifter, and ultimately a leather guy like this. Gay macho was seen in American vernacular as a process of cloning the heterosexual in the body of the homosexual. And so cloning, what I want to call clonophobia, brings together a whole set of issues. An ancient fear of the double or twin, the evil twin or the uncanny double, the fear of unlimited reproduction without heteronormative activity. Homosexuals could reproduce themselves without sexual difference if cloning were allowed. And it's also attached to abortion, since one of the biggest aspects of the antipathy to cloning is the equation of it with a kind of abortion, that in order to clone an organism, you have to destroy something else. So all those issues, all we're called the moral issues, were being mobilized on one side and clustered around this central figure. It's very important to have a central metaphor, and the clone served as that, just as the terrorist served as a central metaphor for the foreign war. I want to conclude this part of the talk with this work of art, which I think brings together cloning and terror in quite a different register, and that's a photo collage by Kevin Clark and Mikey Flowers called From Dust to DNA, which shows the ruins of the World Trade Center with a kind of scrim of the DNA code hovering over it, as if signaling what is in the dust that hung over the World Trade Center. That is, the DNA of both the victims and the terrorists circulating like dust in those ruins, and being breathed in by the survivors on every side, something which, of course, was very bad for their health and continues to be a problem. This image, to me, also suggests the inability to bury the dead, the inability to find the dead in order to bury them, and the kind of endless melancholy and the violent reactions that are produced by this unerasable memory of September 11th. It's as if this is an image that refuses to die, that keeps coming back, but coming back as a kind of toxin, and is best illustrated by the inability to mourn, to use Freud's terminology, an inability which we can see going on and on, now that it's 5 years after, and we still have not figured out a way to memorialize the site of this disaster. Thesis 8, there are 10, by the way, so we're getting close to the end. Number 8, the clone and terrorist converge in the anonymous figures of the post-human acephalic organ donor, the hooded torture victim, the suicide bomber. The identity of clone and terrorist means that, in the words of Walt Kelly, we have met the enemy and he is us. That is, the enemy is our twin, the evil twin, or our mirror image. And particularly this occurs at the level of the image of the sovereign. The terrorist is the twin of the sovereign he opposes. And this is because the terrorist is not merely a criminal and not merely a military figure. He is a rival to sovereign authority. It's as if, and this, if we go back to this figure, you can see how this works. The accused terrorist here on his pedestal as torture victim is paralleled by the figure of the American nation. They are portrayed as twins. But this is an even more dramatic example of it, I think. The figure of national sovereignty, the recruiter for U.S. military power, twinned with Osama bin Laden, or as I like to call him, Uncle Osama. the idea that the sovereign and the terrorist are twins is because the terrorist is a political criminal, a political warrior who is in direct symmetry with the sovereign power that he opposes. He's not simply trying to do things for himself, to gain money, territory, or whatever, but it's a direct challenge to the authority and sovereignty of the enemy. So Uncle Osama, Uncle Sam, perfect twins. And of course, this declaration by Uncle Osama, I want you to invade Iraq, is no more than a literal translation of what Osama bin Laden said many times before September 11th, that the goal of al-Qaeda was to create a provocation that would lure the United States into invading and occupying a Middle Eastern country. In that sense, the World Trade disaster worked perfectly as a classic military ruse to lure you into a battle which you have no chance of winning and which will in fact make things worse. So my conclusion, the war on terror has the effect of cloning terror. This is actually a kind of, I think, self-evident conclusion. Every bit of evidence we have now about the effect of the war on terror is that it has made things much worse. That the number of terror attacks internationally has gone way up since we invaded Iraq. It has given a pretext for jihad all over the world. Al-Qaeda had no presence in Iraq before our invasion. Now Iraq is likely to become a major base for Al-Qaeda when we finally wake up and leave. But we will have nobody to thank but ourselves for that. So what's the answer? What do we do? This, by the way, this is my illustration of the way the war on terror clones terror. This is a wonderful little cartoon, Bionic Abu Ghraib Man, in which you see him turning into a kind of stealth fighter. And I don't know if you can read the captions, but here he comes transformed into a jet fighter headed for Mount Rushmore. And the faces of the president are crying out in alarm, "Oh, Jesus, he's headed right at us." And Jefferson is saying, "Literally or metaphorically? Literally or metaphorically, I can't turn my head." So what is the answer? I think, in a way, this kind of thing is the answer. Oh, this was out of place. This is Richard Clarke's comment. The ingredients al-Qaeda dreamed of for propagating its movement were a Christian government attacking a weaker Muslim region, allowing the new terrorist group to rally jihadists from many countries. So, and remember, Richard Clarke is not a partisan. He was head of counterterrorism under 4 different administrations, including the first year of the Bush administration, when he finally resigned, because he'd been trying to get their attention about the impending catastrophe of September 11th for an entire year and had been unable to get a meeting with anybody. So what's to be done? I think the war on terror can only be ended by a counterattack at the level of images. In other words, this is a call to all artists to get to work, which, I mean, many artists have already been at work, and I hope you've noticed that this is sprinkled with works of satirical art, of culture jamming, of image manipulation, which attempt to either defuse or derail or produce a détournement in the war of images by transforming these images, disenchanting them, or, as in Bionic Abu Ghraib Man, showing their transformation. This was, I think, one of the first salvos, the moment when freewayblogger.com put up this image and said, and declared the war over long before, of course, it is over. You might call it wishful thinking, but if art isn't wishful thinking, I don't know what it is. There's also something coming, which I think I want to preview for you just briefly and tell you. I think that the whole image repertoire of Abu Ghraib, which I could have talked about in much more detail, is about to undergo a radical transformation. Up till now, we've been dealing with the Abu Ghraib images mainly as what you might call cultural icons. That is, anonymous figures. The only proper names have been Lindy England and Charlie Grainer, the sort of regarded as the central figures in this group of 7 or 9 bad apples. But, and of course, there's been an effort to contain this at that level and to say, you know, it was just these bad apples who did this, and to deny responsibility upward. But I think this is about to change. There is actually a documentary on HBO tonight, probably going on within an hour or so. I urge you to tune into that. I haven't seen it myself, but it's about these images. And even more important, as we speak, the filmmaker Errol Morris, who made Thin Blue Line and The Fog of War, is making a film called 9 Bad Apples, which consists of interviews with all the soldiers who were in Abu Ghraib prison and takes you inside and opens up the image repertoire that lay behind it. These are still images from his shooting, including things like this crucifix, which was used strategically in the torture. Also, intravenous feeding bags with Stars of David on them to outrage Islamic prisoners, thinking they were getting Jewish blood injected into their veins, or being forced to assume positions as Christian icons. A kind of religious degradation in a whole scenario, which was far beyond the imagination of the Charlie Grainer or the other soldiers there. In other words, there's a whole story coming out behind the Abu Ghraib prisoners, which will go much higher, right into Donald Rumsfeld's office at a minimum. Errol Morris has constructed a set of Abu Ghraib prison in Hollywood, and as he did in Thin Blue Line, will be walking you through what transpired there. Those photographs, which so far been kind of flat, two-dimensional icons, mainly available for reappropriation and resignification, now you are going to be able to walk into those images and see what was behind them inside Abu Ghraib prison. This is my little picture of the shooting going on. Half a morning was spent photographing the rats of Abu Ghraib. And the cinematographer here is Bob Richardson, who did all of Oliver Stone's films. So these images are not going to go away, and many other images from this war. I think it's been the duty of art historians to keep track of them, not to let them disappear, make sure they're remembered, interpreted, and that we learn something from this whole war of images about how not to get into a war and how to get out of one that we're already in. So I'm letting Hans Hake have the last word. I hope it's obvious why this serves as a kind of coda or summary to the entire argument. This is a figure of he calls it stargazing. It's part of an installation he did in New York about 1.5 years ago called State of the Union. I like to think of this as the emblem of the American public until perhaps November of 2006, when at least part of the hood was lifted and we stopped stargazing, stopped thinking that this war on terror was somehow our patriotic duty, and any questioning of it, questioning of its logic, rightness, justice, was somehow collaboration with the terrorists. In fact, we have been, my friends, torturing ourselves. So this figure of the torture victim is us, and unfortunately, it's also a figure of the torturers who we have paid for. So thanks very much, and I'd be glad to answer questions.